Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Thinking Bitcoin, where Daniel and I have a series of conversations that focus more specifically on Bitcoin, the crypto sphere, and investing in general. So, welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. What are we talking about this afternoon?
Well, this afternoon, I'd really like to discuss in some more detail an article of yours which just recently appeared on Bitcoin.com, where you discuss the tension between the ideas of long term and short term, both in terms of thinking and in terms of investing. So I don't know how many of our viewers will have read it, but I definitely encourage you to have a look. Immediately. I think, speaking for myself, I'm aware of the fact that these terms, short and long, are thrown around all the time. We all use them as if we all had a standardized agreement on their precise definitions. And you are very clear in your article about the fact that long-term thinking is built upon short-term thinking. It made me think about how long-term thinking is simply the composite of a whole set of series of short-term decisions, and that you make some really cogent points about the fact that whether it's a project or a person that you're on a backpacking adventure with, you're interested in people who have competent short-term thinking before you even really consider what they may be saying about their long-term vision.
Sure. Well, thanks. And first of all, we'll figure out how to get the link to the article in the description to the video. If you don't already know how to do this, but for viewers, you should be able to find the link below. And yeah, the reason I wrote this article is I get into arguments with people who say that investors are short-term people, so developers don't have to listen to them, and they're the long-term thinkers. So there's a lot of stuff I disagree with in that view, but in this article, I specifically talked about long-term versus short-term, and yeah, like if you don't have your short-term figured out, then your long-term is a fantasy world. It is not. It is not a real plan. It is just you fantasizing. You know.
That's really interesting because I've come to the space far more so from an investing and philosophical and cultural point of view than, say, a developer or working in the tech field, et cetera. And so what you say is very interesting to me because I am now immersed in a world where I'm really looking at the difference between trading and investing, while also aware of users and then producers. And the thing that really strikes me is that investors, in order to be investors, also precisely have to have a long-term framework, which is very much, as your article talks about, really based on the idea of survival. That the investor is really and should be the strong, the good investor, should be looking at the long-term sustainability of any kind of project, which is, I suppose, a way of commenting on how realistic is your fantasy, you, the developer, you, the business model person, you, whoever it is who's producing something. But I also think that your point about short-term thinking, how good is it, goes to the idea that however great an idea, if you can't execute it, it may be a wonderful idea for somebody to set off on a boat trip to Palau, right? But if you don't have a map and a compass and somebody who knows how to fit the boat out with water, you're not going to get very far.
Yeah, and this idea of survival and short-term versus long-term, that's really important for for the investor himself, because you want to have both of these taken care of in your portfolio. So if you want to own something that you think is going to be more valuable later, you have to be able to keep holding it during the entire time that it's going to realize its value. So you need to sustain yourself over that period, and maybe you have a job or you have something that produces a regular income, like property that has rent or something like that.
and or even you simply keep the dreaded cash, right? Because the one thing you know far more certain about tomorrow and next week than you know about next month or next year is that any kind of financial obligation that you may have, and particularly the ones that you may not anticipate, you may know might occur, but you don't know when they're going to occur, is likely to be in cash, whatever version of fiat cash is available to you. I think that the part about being able to hodl, which is it captures some of the things that I think make a strong investor, but neglects some of the things that I think also make a strong investor, which maybe we can get to, or we can talk about later. The idea of being able to make an investment, which by definition is something that has a longer than not time frame, and for that to be a comfortable decision, which makes you a strong investor, you have to be able to sleep through the night, regardless of what's happening to that price in the interim, related to whatever long is for you. So I think that the risk assessment part preceding the investment part is key. And that really does require people to be honest with themselves about what investing is as opposed to what trading is. And trading can happen over the course of years as well. Trading is, and you can hold the same asset and have part of it designated as investment and part of it designated as trade. But you have to be able to think about these things in different ways. One, you are looking at returns to your investment. The other, the more fundamental, is making decisions. If you're going to move something from the safety of here it is, it's liquid, I've got it right now, into here, you can have it, is are you going to give it back to me?
Yeah.
Or are you going to give it back to me with some on top?
Yeah, well, I actually, you wrote something recently that you showed me, and you made a point in there that I liked a lot, where you said you can be a trader over a long period of time, and I thought that was interesting because to me that's kind of like when there's sort of a tech startup bubble, and people buy worthless companies that just so they can do an IPO later, like
right.
And
Right.
that's a trader mindset. Even if it takes a long time to get out of the company, you're not building for sustainability. You're building something to just pass on to somebody else.
Right, precisely. And when we look in, for example, the altcoin, shitcoin, altcoin, some of it's legit, some of it's full on scam. But when you start looking into that space, right, you'll hear a lot of people talking about 10xing, 100xing, 10,000% return, et cetera. And there are some really cogent, there are awesome traders out there who take a perspective that long-term means as long as it takes to get to 10,000%, which is an entirely legitimate framework to have. It's just not okay to label that investing as opposed to trading. And I'm also not here to make any kind of implicit value judgments about whether or not it's better to be a trader or an investor. I think that the important thing is that you're clear in your own self about what you're doing. And if you're a project or an entity or a business, that you too have a clarity around what an investor in your entity is, what a trader in your entity is, what your users are, and you have a capacity to understand that those groups are going to have differing needs. And if you're going to cater to those in a way that you're in control of, you need to be able to differentiate between what an investor needs primarily, what a trader and what a user needs.
Sure. And well, yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with making money by buying and selling things as long as you're not dishonest about it. So, if something is a crap investment, is a shit coin, but you know how to predict what stupid people are going to do, then go ahead and trade it. I don't see I don't think there's
Right, but
anything wrong
I
with
think
that.
that's really my point, is that in order to be a successful, brash trader, strong trader, you have to not BS yourself about the vehicle that you're placing a bet on.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That
Yeah, that's something that that really bugs me is when people talk up the features of some of these crypto equities, and I'm just like, it is it's all just craziness. Like
But that's
you're
where people are making bets on the fantasy, right? And the people who know that they're betting on the fantasy, and more to the point, they're betting on the bets of other people who are betting on the fantasy. I mean, this is one of the things that is kind of cool about this market being so free and so unregulated, is that you can actually see these mechanisms in place. And part of being, I think, a good trader has to do with the humility part about it's not particularly sexy. It's not the big dopamine rush. You make a decision about an 8% return on something that you know crazy people are going to do 100% in a 5-minute span. And then you go out and do gardening. I mean,
yeah.
it's kind of like investing in that same way. The people who are sitting at a casino kind of just full on speculating, again, I'm sort of amoralistic about it. I just get ranty about it when people start confusing those categories and wanting to take the ways in which you assess those things and move them through categories. That's really my beef.
So well, back to well back to an earlier point you made. Yeah, I think it's a good idea to be several different people at the same time, and each part of your, well, I was going to say portfolio, but I mean just everything that you do to sustain yourself. Because earlier I said you could have a job to have income, and that's not really your portfolio, but that's important. That's an important part of maintaining yourself as an investor. So
It's
you need to be several different people at the same time, and like part of you can be a trader, and part of you can be an investor, and part of you can just be in cash, just waiting for whatever.
or in gold, okay, or in treasuries, or in any other form of, in rare coins. I mean, you can be in whatever version of sustainability strikes your framework. I mean, I had a thought when you were talking about Harry Potter and the hats and the things like that. I think the virtue of writing stuff down, writing down the decisions, it seems so trite, but writing down the reasons why you make the decisions that you make, especially when it comes to portfolios, and why are you choosing to invest in Bitcoin or not Bitcoin? Why are you choosing to invest in any of the other altcoins or not? What are your parameters? And if you're doing it from the point of view of, if you are also doing it from the point of view of, I think, or I would like, or I would be happy with this thing if it makes 10% or 30% or 50% within this amount of time, also write that down. Because what you're really battling against when it comes to being strong is yourself, right? You're battling against doubting your own premises. And if you're not clear about them, or you try to pretend to yourself that a trade that went wrong because you didn't suck it up and get out when it was down 3% is now an investment because you're going to have to wait for it to go up 50%.
Oh yeah.
You know what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Plus on the Bitcoin side, right? Okay, so I mean, now I'm speaking for myself, but I think I speak for many people, which is, fundamentally in Bitcoin's case, there is a structure that, as long as demand even remains the same, the value is structurally designed to increase. And so it is structurally likewise designed to be censorship resistant. So from a
Yeah.
defensive point of view, from the most basic investing 101 point of view, return of capital and non-depreciation of capital, these are the reasons why to get in. Now, what is happening to the price on top by way of markets, traders, and speculators is kind of interesting, right? But it doesn't go to the reasons why I invested in Bitcoin. And being able to maintain the investor hat is a key part of being the kind of person that any project good projects should want to attract to themselves a kind of core baseline of investors, that can then sustain the traders and who are related in some very important but not particularly linear way to the satisfaction of the users.
Sure. Well, okay. Well, back to an earlier point. I mean, this is why. Well, you were saying that you're yourself. You're the enemy. Like, so you have that. That's why it's all about survival. Okay.
We have met the enemy, and it is us.
Right. Yeah. So it's much easier to lose money than it is to make money. And I think it's good to think of your portfolio as being like an extension of your body. And when you lose some, it's somebody ate it. They absorbed it into their body. And to me, the market is kind of like being out in nature, and there are predators around. The only difference is you don't get eaten all at once. You get eaten bit by bit. I mean, usually you
bit by bit.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really good metaphor, right? Because it also allows us to think a little bit about risk. Nobody wants to lose any part of their body, but, we have all played the game. Well, would you rather lose a foot than a hand? Would you rather lose your sight than your hearing? And really, I don't want a shark to come through and take my midriff. So when we think about risk, when we think about how do we account for certainty, uncertainty, risk, and then make investment decisions of the type, when I talk about time, it's really about liquidity. Because I think one of the things that people don't necessarily think too much about, per se, is liquidity. So what you're doing by way of investing is that you're sacrificing liquidity, immediate, your core part. Whatever at any given moment around you is the most liquid thing you can have is the thing that is the most powerful in the shortest term. Because it's here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right? So anything else, the more illiquid it becomes, even if it's the question of I have to log on to my computer and get into my Schwab account or get into my hard wallet and yada, blada, let alone things that you actually need to, find an individuated buyer, like a piece of land or a specialized coin or whatever. So, when we think about how we then deploy that liquidity, and the return, what is a return? A return is compensation for the risk, not only that you may not get it back, in which case you should be talking about big compensation, but it is the risk that you might find yourself screwed without this money.
Yeah. Yeah. You need to, well, that just goes back to what I was saying about being able to sustain yourself. Because if you need the money back before the investment has realized its value, then tough,
Right. And ideally, wealth is giving you the capacity to sit by and let things realize their value for as long as they're going to realize their value, right? Without any concern about what that does to the ability to put, as the Italians say, breakfast and dinner on the table. No? I mean, wealth is always going to be determined as well by some decisions around how big and fancy that breakfast and that dinner need to be. So, I mean, I think it's also important to recall that ability to survive, as we've talked about before, also depends on what the necessities of survival are. No? So, I mean, that's a bit of a tangent. I think one of the things that's really interesting to discover is that there is perhaps a cultural resistance from the developers world with regards to investors being by definition traders. And so I think there's a real opportunity for education there, okay, in the software developing culture.
Yeah, okay. I think that's a really good point, because to me, the investor I talked about earlier who buys tech startups to do IPOs later, that is kind of how these people are thinking about investors. But really, like, if you have a cryptocurrency and it is not being held by people who are strong and who are holding it for the long term, then it's not really going to be very good. It's going to be something that isn't sustainable.
I
Okay,
think
and it's really like the strong people who are putting their they're taking a risk in this currency, and sustaining themselves. That's what makes the currency sustainable.
right, and it brings to mind the word faith. I mean, they're putting their faith in you, the project themselves, their thesis. I mean, when I was listening to you, what I was thinking about is that I was thinking about venture versus vulture capitalists, right? And I have a lot of peers who have been in the kind of VC world and so on for the last 10, 15 years. There's no question that um, programmers, techies, geeks, also my tribe, right back to the 90s have had to make kind of cultural deals with the devils. And they have the VC firms, or I think in the space, it's often referred to as sort of institutional investors or Wall Street or whatever. That form of flow of capital to project is very capitalism 2.0, 3.0. I think one of the cool things about the way in which cryptosphere is evolving is that it is really allowing for, all fantasy kind of discounted, capitalism 4.0. And unfortunately, one of the things that is, I think, not being really connected very well yet is that on the side of the individuals who in the aggregate have the wealth to invest in anything, there are these ways opening up whereby one can actually have a greater alignment of the sort of value systems that the programmers bring to the projects, that people who are also investing bring to the projects. Because a lot of the kind of change the world, do good stuff, liberate mankind of whatever flavor that is, including being able to order any type of ice cream, to your door through your computer. Those things are not necessarily aligned with corporations that are mandated to make profits to distribute to shareholders who are not necessarily the users who are making the value proposition. And I think a lot of the alt projects, the ones that are legit, the ones that are doing interesting things in the space for real, are exactly kind of presenting the possibility for investors to be more aligned with the kind of long-term thinking that developers think they have a monopoly on.
So I want to go back to this idea of long-term thinking as a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So one other thing about this is that like if you want to succeed, you have to be better than other people at something.
Yeah.
But you don't you can be too much better, right? You will have to be better than other people. But if you put all of your resources into your core competency or whatever, then you might not have anything left for anything else, because you have to be at least somewhat competent in other things, right? So it's possible to think too far ahead, really, because you only have to think further ahead than everybody else. And
That's a really nice point.
if you were thinking farther ahead than that, why bother?
Right. No, that's a really nice point, that you only have to be thinking further ahead than everybody else. You also have to only be slightly more right than everybody else. You don't have to be right about everything. No.
Yeah. And that's a lot better if you have that attitude, because it's easier to be slightly more right than it is to be right about everything. So like
that's totally correct. That's totally correct. I also think that your point is well taken. If one starts to think about accounting for unknown variables that increase in chance of having an impact. So your ability to maintain the capacity to do something in addition to your core competency, right? Retaining enough, whether it's intellectual resource or attitudinal resource or just straightforward resource, to adapt um, to recognize that whatever your core competency is, that itself may need to evolve or change or be tweaked. Allows for survival, right? Long enough to get to any of the long-term places you might want to go. I think a lot about the ways in which, uncertainties do compound over time. And that one of the things that we do a poor job on is precisely this point you make, which is realizing that our long-term decisions are simply the composite of multiple micro short-term decisions.
Well, and that's another thing is like, can you plan that far ahead? Because like you might say Joseph Stalin was a long-term thinker, right? Because he was saying, let's figure out the production problem once and for all, right? But he could never figure out the short term, so things just got worse and worse. Now, of course, well, that's assuming that he was really trying to create communism, but he also wanted to just to murder people a lot too.
Power for the sake of power, right? Is probably one of the oldest, most ancient weaknesses we have. So, for sure,
that's definitely my weakness. So
I think it's all of our weakness, and that's why we should build in, help ourselves, right? Like recognize who we are. This is where a lot of my impatience with certain kinds of moralizing comes in, because you're not actually going to get better behavior if you try to better behavior out of yourself or anybody else. If you try to simply convince humans to convince themselves that they're not human, I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's the whole be God on earth thing. And that's absurd. So, if we know that power is intoxicating and corruptive, and there isn't a person on the planet who's good enough to resist it at some point on some level, then we structurally prevent people from being exposed to it or having it for too long. I mean, what else do we do, right?
Well, I mean, I wish we did that, but yeah.
If we were smart, we would, right? If we were really smart, we would.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to examining yourself, examining your own weaknesses, because if you can think about that for an entire society, and our society doesn't do that enough, in my opinion.
I think so. I think it's related to this huge fear that if we somehow kind of acknowledge our weaknesses, that we won't survive the acknowledgement. It's a little bit like why people can be very wary of and refuse to have intense emotional experiences, because they're afraid that they simply won't survive them. I mean, not to go all off onto our other series type of conversation, but it's really why the Greek tragedy was sort of set up, I think, in many ways, right? Was for people to be able to know that they could experience intense emotion and survive it. So if we have a society that is entirely organized around like preventing anybody from ever feeling anxious, and yet what we have are like skyrocketing levels of anxiety disorder, you have to ask, right? Like, what the fuck is going on? So yeah, I think that investors should want to be the kind of investors that are worthy of their investments, because they're demanding that their investments be worthy of them, and a lot of that does have to do with the strength that's to be had from acknowledging weaknesses, acknowledging differences, and planning for them, including, as you point out, right, planning for the fact that you can't plan. And that ultimately your article is really talking about this, I think, in the sense of what you really want is for somebody, if you're going to go on an adventure, you want somebody who's capable of thinking on the back foot and coming up to a solution with a problem that suddenly appears, so you can keep going.
So let's talk about that example, because what I said in the article is that if I'm going on an adventure and I can only take one person with me, and my choice is somebody who knows how to survive for the next 5 minutes, or somebody who doesn't know how to survive but who has a long-term plan, well, I need to take the 5-minute person first. That he's the one who comes with. Maybe we'll figure something out in the next 5 minutes. But if I only have the long-term person, then I'm screwed right off the bat. So I would need to have two people. I would need to be able to take two people with in order to have both the 5-minute survival and the long-term plan. And
no, I think that's right. And it makes me think of the fact that, if you go off only, let's say, so it's two things. One is, well, you shouldn't, as an investor, it's great to have more than one project, right? And you don't really want to be involved in a scenario where if you're involved in one project, you somehow can't be involved in another project. I mean, that's a ridiculous framework, right? But I think that in terms of going on an adventure, if you're involved in a project that's only long-term, competent in their long-term visions, you end up carrying that project through the bits where they can't survive. Kind of like if you go off with somebody who's like great at the fantasy vision thing, but sucks at executing the plan, you are going to be packing their backpack. You are going to be making all of the phone calls. You are going to be dealing with all of the stuff. So from an investor point of view, if you are trying to convince yourself that hanging in for the long term with a project that's all good about later and kind of sucks about now, the value of your investment is going to show that you're carrying that. And is that really what you want to be doing?
Oh, so one I have one last point about rationality and planning. So I am a fan of rationality, but I'm also skeptical that any particular person has it. So and you have to be skeptical of yourself as
Right.
well as other people. So when I think that people imagine plans a lot. Well, we talk about the Illuminati sometimes, right? Like people imagine that there are plans when really like it seems like most stuff is just craziness, and we have this bias to see planning and rationality everywhere, when it makes more sense to say that there's just craziness everywhere, and over long enough time scales, you are crazy, and I am crazy, and everybody is crazy. You're only rational over a limited time scale, and after that, everything that happens is nonsense.
It's an interesting thing because I know that you use very effectively, and I think also in this article, the phrase chaos, which I think, kind of less tongue in cheek is a good substitute for crazy, in the sense that I agree, rationality is always a moving target. You can decide, deduce what's rational in a given moment with a set of circumstances, right? Just like any kind of scientific experiment. If you have a set of variables, you want to test for one, okay, but those variables are moving all the time. So the context in which what looks to be a rational decision is changing from moment to moment. Yeah. And I think that if we were honest, all people would acknowledge that what in retrospect looks like a plan is actually the aggregate of a lot of chaotic moments resolving themselves given whatever seems rational at that particular moment. And so, a little bit like the nature of the universe, what you look at from a macro level is totally different from when you really get into the crunch of what is happening moment to moment, day to day, week to week. And that therefore, a sense of chaotic, a sense of, there are these rational tools, but they're only kind of momentary snapshots of any given point in the chaos. And that the stories we tell ourselves about how that's all not chaos after the fact is kind of, it's bizarre because it's the way we create meaning. We seem to be hardwired to do it, but the only way to stay sane within it, as you point out, is to remain skeptical about your own narrative, right?
Sure. And so actually, I want to do what you just said as a future topic, and I want to add, you should figure out how to make decisions that can can look rational later.
Right,
So
right.
you should do something that is step one today, step one of many possible future plans, and and you should be able to decide on step two later, so that it fits in with whatever step one is. And if you can do that, then you look like a genius later on. That's
Which
not
is
easy,
perfect
but
because we all want to look like geniuses later on, right?
yeah, right. So I don't have anything else on this topic. Oh, well, actually, I wanted to mention the thing about order out of chaos, because we,
Hmm.
we did talk about this, but I didn't relate that phrase. Like if you have a steady income, like a job or rent or something, then that's order out of chaos,
Right.
because you are doing the same thing uh, every day over a period of time, and you get a steady income, and then that enables you to uh, construct something over that time. So if you can have this part of you that is orderly, that means the other part of you can be creative. So that's kind of what I meant about order out of chaos.
I think that's perfect. And I would love to maybe leverage off into another conversation, debate the merits of the concept of universal basic income or the kind of net aggregate um, increase in productivity, happiness, and health that a collection of human beings can potentially experience if we precisely provide or we find ourselves all provided with a degree of stability, that very basic Maslowian stability that is required for anybody to have any excess to do anything.
Sure.
Um,
Well, sure, we can talk about it later, but I would just say that if I'm going to help other people be stable, I also want to reserve the right to stop helping them if I don't think they are doing anything worthwhile with that stability.
I agree.
And
I think I'm more of the English kind of the English tradition, which is like, look, as long as you're not fucking with my capacity to do so, not having you die horribly of disease on my front step is a good thing. So yeah. So net positive, net negative. It's definitively worth debating, right? What kind of um, I mean, effectively trade people are making amongst themselves as a group. But this part about individuals wanting to be in an environment where everybody has a reasonably equal opportunity through effort to create sufficient stability so as to have anything left over time or energy wise as to be creative, you know, is a reasonable demand. And if we kind of close off with a reference to Bitcoin, I think that the censorship resistant sort of disintermediating libertarian roots, has any kind of real resonance. It may be in that area where people do feel that they do have the right to be not slaves. And they do have the right to have the capacity of basic and sufficient effort pay off sufficiently so as they can contribute something else to this whole project of being a human on the earth.
okay, well, I don't have anything else, so
And I
I guess you
encourage
don't either.
anybody
So,
viewing to watch to read the article, which we will link below. And thank you.
well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the discussion, and I'll see
Always.
you later.
Bye bye. Bye, Diane.
Bye.